All right. All right, we'll go ahead and start. My name is Koen. I want to say thank you so much for joining us. Outside of the studio, we started to do some introductions to the kinds of ways that we want to work, and we want to continue that inside the studio. I also want to introduce you to a couple of my partners that will also be joining us. One is Heather. She is my robot. I love Heather. She's accurate. Whenever I type in a search, she's able to give me some profound information. So you'll be hearing from Heather. You'll also be hearing some voiceovers from Rory. Rory is our partner in Ireland, and I really appreciate his work. And so you'll hear from him as well as we engage in this process. And lastly, what you will see are also some vignettes. We'll do a cut to some YouTube videos. We'll do some transitions, but I'll let you know where we are in the process so you don't feel lost. We know that the concepts that we're dealing with for many people are new and in some ways controversial. But we want to make sure that we handle this with care and with confidence so that we can communicate in a way that actually engages us to movement. We know that diversity and inclusion conversations can be tricky conversations. People may not necessarily know what to say or what to think. But we want to offer this particular opportunity for you to be a critical thinker. We're not asking you to believe everything that we're offering. We don't expect that you will accept everything at face value. Please do your own research, but consider the concepts that we're offering to you today. And just like we said in our introduction, we're talking about racial implicit bias or implicit racial bias, however you want to say it. It's the same concept. And so as we go through that, there are a few topics, and you'll find those right here, that we'll first start talking about, what implicit bias is. We'll answer that question. We'll talk about the implicit brain. How is it that our minds are organized to deal with implicit bias? We'll talk about what is race, and really try to tease that out, because I think we may be surprised at what it is versus what we think that it is. And we have a couple of cohorts that will spell that out for us. So we'll kick things off to them as well. So also we'll talk about this idea of disparities, because when we talk about race, ultimately we need to have some conversations about the disparities that are caused by race. And then how do we change our own minds? How do we start thinking, acting, and behaving differently, and taking responsibility for our implicit bias? And then lastly, our stories. How is it that we tell our stories, or why is it important that we tell our stories? And I will say this at this point in time, that if you don't know where you come from, it's difficult for other people to have their stories. And so we'll talk and get engaged in that piece of content as well. And lastly, in our closing, it is my hope that we'll get to a place where you'll start to develop and talk about some action plans for yourself as well as for your organization. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So I will be referring to some of my notes. So if you see me looking away, that's what's happening. So welcome. This particular training, again, is one that we want to engage you in a conversation about implicit bias. And we'll start to delve into what implicit bias is in just a moment. I do want you to recognize that we all come from a context, and we all suffer from the human frailty of that being human, of being vulnerable. And so as you engage in this particular content, I would encourage you to think critically about your own behaviors, and not so much on our delivery or on how flashy things are, but really focus on what it is that you can do, that ways in which you can think that might make you more actionable in the world. All right, so that's the first thing. So we want to go to this conversation around what is racial implicit bias. And so for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick over to Rory, and Rory will go through some definitions. And once Rory's done with his definitions, we'll come back and tell some anecdotal stories about that definition. So over to you, Rory. All right. I hope that those definitions that Rory gave us can be actionable, that they weren't too esoteric, that they actually were concrete and made sense. And so how do implicit biases act or behave once we have them? And one of the ways I would suggest that oftentimes implicit bias shows itself is through our blind spots. Now, one of the things that is important for us to I recognize that coming from my particular context, there are certain things that I may be blind to. And those pieces that I'm blind to aren't my fault, but they are my responsibility. And so I was born in Ohio to African American parents. My paternal grandparents had degrees and went on to higher education. My maternal grandparents did not. They were laborers and sometimes found themselves in need of financial assistance from the government, right? So I came from those two particular backgrounds, and my parents came from those backgrounds, which set up a particular context for me. In 1968, something incredibly happened. I mean, something incredibly important happened, particularly to my father or in my father's sphere of influence, and that was the assassination of Dr. King. And when Dr. King was assassinated, that really had a ripple effect on my father's life. And he joined a group called the Black Panthers. And I don't know what you know about Black Panthers or what you've heard about Black Panthers, but primarily they were a political party. Their goals and their objectives were to free people from poverty, and specifically Black people from poverty. So he became a Panther, a radical, if you will. At some point, he realized that the revolution wasn't paying and that the retirement plan for revolutionaries was not a good one. So he left the revolution. He got a call from God. He had an experience that changed his life with God, and he became a fire and brimstone evangelical pastor. So yes, I'm a preacher's kid. And as a result of growing up in that environment that was somewhat radical, and taking that same kind of radicalness and applying spiritual principles to that, I was born in a bastion of change. So social responsibility as well as emotional and spiritual connectedness was where I was bathed, where I was born, right? And so that particular context gives me a particular kind of worldview. Some folks are raised or born in rural areas, and that creates a context. That creates blind spots. And I suggest that those blind spots that also happen for folks who are in urban areas, large cities, they also have blind spots. And so if I take a person from an urban area and I put them in a rural area, and I take a person from a rural area and put them in an urban area, one might say that those blind spots create conflict as they try to relate to one another. One could also say that they can learn how to adapt to those environments because they both have intelligence. And so it is our intelligence that allows us to overcome our biases. So we'll talk more about biases in just a moment. So I'm going to talk more about this idea of the implicit brain. The implicit brain. And for the implicit brain, what I'd like to do is just kick this over to Heather. Heather, can you talk a little bit about the implicit brain? Thanks, Heather. That was an excellent definition. I really appreciate it. Again, my computer lover. So this idea of the implicit brain, it becomes really very important because we understand that our primal brain looks for danger, and it asks the question, are things dangerous or are they not? We also know that our prefrontal cortex that wraps itself around that primitive brain is where our higher order of functioning goes, where our higher reasoning comes from. And it's with that reasoning that we have the opportunity to override our instinctual or our programmed methods of looking at the world. And so when we talk about things like race, or we talk about any kind of differences, it is our primal brain that registers any type of difference, either in our tribe, in our clique, in our gender, in our context, any type of difference. The automatic response to that difference, according to our primal reptilian brain, is to ask the question, is this dangerous or not? And 9 chances out of 10, if we're not focused, if we're not made aware of those questions that our primal brain is asking, the response typically will be yes. The default place for our reptilian brain is to see anything that is different as dangerous. And so it takes our conscious mind to override those primal instincts. And I'd like to suggest that even in our social constructs, we've developed these biases as a part of our constructs of living in community together. So and here's some examples. And you may say, Andre, you're really out there with these, but just think about this for a second. So so there is magic, but when the magic is bad, it is called black magic, right? When we talk about cakes, the light, fluffy, white, airy cake is called angel food cake. The dark chocolate, decadent, rich brown cake is called devil's food cake. When people die, what do they wear, or what are you supposed to wear in honoring their death? Black. When there is a wedding, the bride is expected to wear what color to represent new life and birth? White. When we do religious ceremonies, be it christenings of babies or baptisms of babies, what colors are they to wear? White, for purity. I find it interesting that when clubs want to close down, they turn on the lights. Why? Because this dichotomy of dark and light plays itself out in some fundamental ways that reach back to some of our primal ways of thinking. And I suggest to you that our ancestors did that for a particular reason. They did that out of a context. It was important that they know how to do that they know how to survive in dangerous situations. Fortunately and unfortunately, the context for that behavior has changed. And so when we try to apply good and bad, dark and light to human behavior, we fall short because human behavior is not that simple. It's very complex. The things that motivate us to do things, the possibilities of being able to do things can absolutely be surprising. And so when we operate with that reptilian brain, we're not curious about other people. We form schemas, we form stereotypes, we become bigoted in our emotions, and we stop being interested in others. Wow, that was a great segue. So now that we're coming back, let's talk about this concept of race. And race is a very important concept because it is set up by our governments. And so with that, I'd like to kick this back out for another video transition. So let's watch another video. Wow, did you know that about race? Did you know the category for white people? Yeah, I find it interesting that when we even talk about race, right, that a Ford F-150 any place on the planet is a Ford F-150. But isn't it interesting that race changes depending on what governments you're a part of? And so this concept of race is a fallacy. Race doesn't really exist. However, I would say that the process of racialization and the process of racism, or the product being racism, do exist. Racialization is the process where we try to take human beings and convince them that they are a particular race. And so we create forms, we make mandates that people continually tell us about their race. And racism is the economic system by which race operates. And I would suggest to you that this racism is the economic system where race becomes the currency. And what do I mean by that? I know that sounds kind of strange, or you may not have heard it this way before, but I believe that racism is this economic system where race is the currency. And if we look at many indicators in our society, those indicators point to what I'm suggesting. So think about neighborhoods and property values. How do those fall? Oftentimes, race is the consideration for where those high property values and low property values are. When we talk about housing stock and property values, we also have to talk about education system, because how do schools get funded? Through property taxes. And so when we have a group of people that look the same in a particular community, and there is high property value or low property value, what we start to recognize is that the schools that come out of those communities are directly linked to the folks who are in those communities. And so I suggest that when we see race as a proxy, that racism is happening, and that it is not just a feeling, an emotional response to difference, but it is actually an economic system where race becomes the currency. And so that becomes the lead-in to this idea of disparities. So let's talk a little bit about disparities. What are disparities? What I would suggest is that disparities are those gaps that are a result of implicit bias. And I would say that implicit bias is the fuel for systemic oppression. That people's unawareness of their biases plays out, particularly as people try to say that I'm not biased, or that I don't have a tendency to favor or dislike one group or another. I want to put it very plainly and very clearly. We all have biases because we all come from a limited context. And so that limited context has some direct impact on our behavior. There is a concept of therapy called cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. And what CBT basically, one of the basic tenets of CBT is that emotions plus thoughts dictate behaviors. And if I have implicit bias thoughts, if I have prejudicial thoughts, if I have bigoted thoughts, then and I have bigoted emotions, the only outcome can be discrimination unless I monitor and change those things. So cognitive behavior therapy suggests that our emotions plus our thoughts dictate our behavior. So if I have bigoted emotions, if I have prejudicial or biased thoughts, then the outcome will be that discrimination will soon follow. That does not mean that every time that I'm engaged with someone that I will act in a prejudiced way or a bigoted way, or that I will violate their rights and discrimination. But it does say that at some point those things will occur because your emotions and your thoughts dictate your behaviors. And so when we talk about disparities, what we're talking about is the gap that gets created based on a number of particularly professionals who or systems that don't create quality opportunities for everyone. And so for more on disparities, I like to just kick this back over to Rory. So Rory, can you talk more about disparities? Great. So now we have a good sense of disparities and what disparities are. What I'd like to do is start to delve into what are some ways in which we can start to create a different mindset for ourselves. How do we fight these implicit bias tendencies that we may have? And so how do we start to change our mind? One thing that I'd like to suggest to you, and this comes out of just my personal experience, I recognize that the car that I drive has blind spots. And I know where those blind spots are, right? So they're usually over the shoulders, there are blind spots behind me, there are blind spots in front of me, and I drove a Hummer once, and the whole thing is a blind spot, right? Now, the blind spot is not my fault, but it is my responsibility. So how do I take responsibility for my blind spots? First of all, there are two ways to find out about blind spots. There are two ways to find out about your implicit bias. One is to crash into something, to make a mistake, to say the wrong thing at the wrong place at the wrong time. The second is to look for them. And so when I'm in a rental car, one of the first things that I try to do, or I try to make sure that I focus on, is adjusting the mirror so I can see those blind spots. So I have to look for things that I don't know are there, and that is the only way I'll be able to find them. There are also a number of other ways that you can start challenging and changing your mind. So let's watch this. Great, those seem like some practical tools. I hope you'll be able to add those to your toolkit. And lastly, we want to talk about how is it that we are able to share our own stories. And what I would like to offer you is that if you're not aware of your own biases, if you're not aware of your own prejudicial thinking, it is difficult to actually hear or see other people express joy about being who they are. If you don't know who you are, it's difficult to enjoy someone else being who they are. We'll come back to that. So the birth of implicit bias as a field of study stems from a shooting back in 1999. And that particular shooting found some very interesting commonalities The birth of racial implicit bias. The birth of implicit racial bias, a study. It's important for us to realize the birth of racial implicit bias. The birth of implicit racial bias. As we study or as we share this information with you, I want to share a little bit of the background of how we've come to this particular study. And so with that, I'll kick this over to Heather. Wow, I bet you never thought that implicit bias could have such a dramatic impacts on people's lives. And so it's important for us to realize how when we realize the importance of taking control of our own minds and our own actions, we can then be more prepared to impact lives in a more concrete and productive way. Now, this might be a difficult truth for you to swallow, but we've all had our moments where we have been, we've stereotyped people, we may have even been bigoted, and may have even had some kind of racist thoughts, right? Or prejudice that we hold against one group or another. We also can understand that other people have also, that we've also been a victim of other people's worldviews, of their prejudice, of their racist ideas and their bigotry and their implicit bias. And so what I'd like to do now is I want to show a short film that really talks about how people are impacted and what happens as a result of people being impacted or acting on their stereotypes, their bias, and their implicit bias. So with that video, we'll start now. So given the scenarios that were presented in that clip, how do you think the young man will engage the world? Is he willing or ready to give 100% best and smile in the face of adversity? Or might there be a bit of polish, shine taken off of his polished life? When we talk about this idea, we have to give each other grace to know that we all have these things, but it's only through communication and thoughtfulness are we able to rise above some of those limiting thoughts that we've known. I oftentimes do this in my workshops, and I ask my participants to do this. I ask them to think about a stereotype about another group. So you do that. You think about a stereotype about another group. And then I want you to take your hands, and I want you to firmly put your hands around your family tree. And I want you to shake your family tree. And do any of those stereotypes fall out of your family tree? Do you have people who are drunk? Do you have people who steal? Do you have people who are trying to live off the system? I would suggest that most of us do some kind of combination of those stereotypes. And so whatever we can say about another group of people, not only can we say about our group of people, but we can actually probably apply that to our own family. And so we're not as different as we oftentimes think that we are. And what I typically call that, is that we oftentimes suffer from optical illusions. Optical illusions, artificial barriers to authentic human relations. Sometimes a woman said, well, isn't it optical illusion? No, that's something different. Optical illusions are those artificial barriers that that are created to prevent us from having authentic human relations. And some of those things are things, social constructs like race, or like strict gender roles, or economic status. These are all things that are artificial barriers to authentic human relations. And I'm not sure if you've ever experienced this, but I've experienced this firsthand, where you have children who don't know each other, and the only thing that they yearn to do is play, no matter what they look like. They yearn to play with each other until we teach them how to be racist, right? And so that's something that is learned. That is not something that is innate. That people want to be in relationship with other people, and that the conflicts that we see are just optical illusions. My wide nose and my curly beard and my brown skin has no meaning beyond what other people apply to it. And so it's important for us to realize that we all come from context, that we all have limited experiences, but it is human for us to arise above those experiences and engage each other in very powerful and meaningful ways. When we talk about this idea of implicit racial bias, it's important to recognize that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. And so our social lenses, as you'll see in this diagram, our social lenses don't allow us to see the world as it is, but it allows us to see the world as we are. And so all too often we define what is good or what is bad, or what life's meaning is, based on our worldview, on how we were raised, on our particular paradigm. And a paradigm is very simply defined as the way you see the world. And the way you see the world will determine what it is that you're able to see. And so if you have a pessimistic way of seeing the world, then you'll see pessimism, right? You'll see the worst in human beings. If you have optimism as a worldview or a paradigm, in every situation that you find yourself in, you'll find some good in that situation. And so when we succumb to stereotypes, when we succumb to our biases, it's interesting, but that's what we end up seeing. And so with that, I encourage you to think critically and look past your paradigms. Take into account those things that you've been given, those things that you've been taught, and look at the context by which you're operating and ask yourself, are these helpful things, or are these things that need to be set aside so that I can live in this new and greater context? Implicit racial bias is a stepping stone, or a piece of an equation that actually leads us to discrimination. And so part of our job is to decrease discrimination, to alleviate the pain caused by discrimination, by managing and understanding our bigotry and our prejudice. And so I mentioned earlier that this concept of CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. That cognitive behavior therapy says that emotions plus our thoughts dictate our behaviors. And in this particular diagram, what I wanted to demonstrate is that bigotry plus prejudice equals discrimination. The very same formula for changing how we think about ourselves is also used to perpetuate the things that we don't want in our society. And so 1964 Civil Rights Act was signed, so the government said that we will take care of discrimination. It is our responsibility to take care of how people behave, particularly in the workplace, and more specifically when there are federal funds and state funds engaged in that process. And so the government said that they will take care of discrimination, how people behave, how they act. How people feel and how people think is up to us to manage, right? So I can have any emotional state that I want. I can think any thought that I want. And so there are no laws prohibiting me to think or feel any particular kind of way. However, in our organizations, what we recognize is that those thoughts and those feelings lead to behaviors. And so it is our responsibility to check people on their thoughts and their feelings. And the first place to start is at your dinner table. When you have those family gatherings, muster up enough courage to at least question what people say when they say things that are not in congruence with this concept of diversity, that don't secure constitutional rights for people. Engage people in that conversation. Because once we engage folks, then they start to become critical thinkers. And it is through that critical thinking process that we actually can change people's behavior. So context is everything. So depending on your context, you will have certain kinds of limitations or bias. And so I want you to take a look at this picture right here, and I want you to tell me, where are these people sitting? Just think about that. So where do you see these people sitting? Yes. So some people may say that they're sitting on the floor, that they're sitting in a room, that they're obviously cozy and whatnot. And I would say that that is a particular world view. That is one way of seeing the world. Given the context that we have in Western culture, in our relationship to how we view things, we develop blind spots, we develop biases, and this particular picture is full of biases and full of the mental constructs that we have based on our particular context. And so, it's very interesting that asking East Africans to look at the same picture, they come up with a different story. And in this particular example, a number of East Africans were asked, where was this family sitting? And the response was that they were sitting under a tree. And so then ask, what is that thing? So what's going on with that thing on the side of the picture? The response was that the woman is balancing something on her head. Context is everything. How you see the world determines exactly how you see the world, right? And so neither one of those is wrong. Saying that they're in a room is not wrong. Saying that they're under a tree and the woman is balancing something on her head is not wrong. They just are different ways of seeing the world. And when we hold on to just our way of seeing the world, that's where this idea of implicit bias starts to come in. We make the assumptions that no matter, contrary to the actual evidence, that our way of seeing the world is the right way to see the world. And that's where we start to develop this idea, this concept of implicit bias, that it can't be any other way than how I see the world. So during this course, we've talked a little bit, or we've tried to answer the question, what is racial implicit bias? we've looked at the implicit brain. What is race? What are disparities? How do we start to change our minds? What tools can we use to change our minds? And how do we start to tell our own stories, or why is it important to tell our own stories? And so as we close this particular session, I'd encourage you to think about the concepts that we've given here, the films that we've watched, the conversations that we've had, and think about how you can challenge your own implicit bias and why it's so important to do so. My name is Koen. I want to thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you be actionable in the world. This is Koen. Have a great day. Bye.